So let's try to improve things a little bit more and work with 802.11n. In 2003, you have 54 megabit per second in 2.4 gigahertz. You also have it in 5 gigahertz, but it's taking off very slowly. But already 54 is slow. The wired connections can be 100 megabit per second, and they are working on 1 gigabit per second communications. So we need to go faster. And that's where the 802.11n amendment comes into play. There are a few things that we do, and it took them a while to get that amendment right. So it came out in 2009, and it tries to improve speed in both bands, 2.4 and 5 gig. And it's relying on OFDM. So what N does is to improve speed for G clients and for A clients. It doesn't care about DSSS, that's all things. We work from OFDM here. And the good thing about 11n is that it's not focusing on a band like we're doing so far. It's working on features. You bring new features to G devices and to A clients to make them more efficient in their communication. And there are a few things that we do. One of them is channel aggregation. Remember our channels? We are using 20 megahertz with OFDM, right? And as you remember, there are some channels that are unused at the bottom, some channels that are unused at the top, and also one channel that is unused in the middle. And there are a couple of channels that are used to estimate the channel by just sending a predetermined signal that we use to determine the noise in those various areas of the 20 megahertz channel. So the idea is to say, if we use one 20 megahertz channel, why don't we take two of them and just stick them together? That would be us using 40 megahertz instead of 20 megahertz, still with OFDM, right? And that's, of course, doubling the communication. And in fact, it's more than doubling because, if you remember, we had 64 subcarriers, among which only 48 were actively used for communication. But if you were unusing the ones at the top and the one at the bottom, then if you join two, the ones that you were not using that happen to be in the middle, you can reuse them this time because they are not at the top and the bottom anymore. So that means that you can, in fact, reuse some of the channels that we're not using before. Also, the calibration carriers, you can spread them a little bit more across the 14 megahertz band, which means that altogether, if you count all the channels you have now, 128, those that you want to use for channel estimation, those that you do not want to use for isolation between channels, then you end up having 108 tones versus 48 before. So you more than double your communication. In fact, right by adding these two channels from 54 megabit per second, you can have now up to 101 megabit per second. That's much better. So channel aggregation is a great thing. It's a great thing, but it's not a great thing everywhere, because if you look at the 2.4 gigahertz band, where do you find 40 megahertz channels? We have already only 3 non-overlapping 20 megahertz channels. So if you make one large 40 megahertz channel, you see it spans from channel 1 to channel 7. There is no space for a second one. So if you use 40 megahertz in 2.4, well, you basically have only one 40 megahertz channel, and then you can have a 20 megahertz channel next to it, but you cannot have more than one 40 megahertz channel. This is why on Cisco equipment, they do not support channel aggregation in 2.4, because they say in an enterprise environment, there is no use case where you would use that. At home, maybe, if you have a home equipment, maybe that equipment supports 40 megahertz in 2.4 because it assumes that you have only one AP in your house, so you can use that space. But in an enterprise environment, you necessarily have neighbors, access points that belong to you or that belong to some other companies, so you cannot use 40 megahertz in 2.4. In 5 gigahertz, oh yes, definitely. Here, there is a lot of space. So again, in Cisco equipment, you can use channel aggregation in 5 gigahertz without any problem, but not on 2.4. In the amendments, there are a list of possible channels that you can aggregate, which means that you don't have the right, for example, to aggregate channel 40 and 44. You have to make pairs that are not going to disrupt possible neighbors that may want to make pairs as well. So if you want to link channel 40 with one channel, you will have to use channel 36 to link it. If you want to link channel 44 to something, you will have to link it to 48. So there are definite pairs that you can use, and you don't have the right to use any combination you want. This means that some channels cannot be aggregated with any other because there is a list of an odd number of channels, and the last one simply doesn't have its counterpart. So keep that in mind. When you use channel aggregation, you have to know which channel you're using, so you can know as well which other channel you can use along with that one. You cannot just pick and choose whichever you want. In most cases, in a controller, for example, it's automatic. If you say my prime channel is going to be 40 and I want to use 40 megahertz, it's going to automatically link it to 36. You won't have the choice to do it. It's going to do it automatically for you. But if you want to do it manually, you have to remember that you cannot choose 44. You have to use 40 and 36. Another thing that 11n brings is a packet acknowledgement that is set in a burst. It's called a block. Before, as you remember, you have to send a frame and each unicast frame has to be acknowledged. In 2005, there is an amendment that came out that was called 802.11e that we mentioned in the previous module a little bit, and that was already allowing you to aggregate some frames. But 11n goes further and allows you to send a block of frames, and then after this block is being sent, you just send one single acknowledgement from the entire block. And when you send that acknowledgement, you say which frames in the block got received properly and which ones were not received, which allows you to only resend those in the block that were not received properly. This is a big difference from the 802.11e way of doing that block, where you would send the same block, but then you would acknowledge one frame after the other, which was not very efficient. So 11n brings that block concept in a very efficient manner. 802.11n also brings something else which is called the short guard interval. So to understand what this does, let's rewind a little bit. When you send an OFDM symbol, in fact, the symbol itself lasts for 3.2 microseconds. But the time between one symbol and the next one is 4 microseconds, which means that you have 3.2 microseconds of useful data and 800 nanoseconds where there is no useful data. In fact, you just repeat what you just sent. And the reason for that is, as you may remember, that we want the echoes to be occurring and going back to your frame before you send the next chunk that is going to be useful. So after each symbol, you keep it quiet for a little bit to let the echoes come back, and then you send the next useful part of the frame. So you have that 800 nanoseconds silence or non-useful section of the frame between each symbol. So the idea here is to say, instead of having that silence that you see here every time or that non-useful section of the frame, why don't we reduce that duration of 800 nanoseconds to something smaller? And if you use a faster speed, which you can do with 11n, maybe these echoes are not going to be damaging that much. And anyway, what we measure indoor is that it never takes 800 nanoseconds for the echoes to come back. It takes, in most environments, 10 nanoseconds. In worst case scenario, in large open environments, it may take up to 50 nanoseconds, but we are way, way, way below 800. So why don't we reduce that silence, which is called the guard interval, from its normal duration, 800 nanoseconds, to something smaller, for example, 400 nanoseconds. And that's the idea of SGI, short guard interval, reducing that silence from 800 to 400 nanoseconds. Does it work well? Well, it depends very much on the environment, because although in lab measurement, there is never any echo in the air that comes back to you after 50 nanoseconds. There may be echoes of echoes of echoes. So in some cases, you may turn on SGI and you may still have a very good communication and just a higher data rate just a tiny bit because you are reducing that silence, and that makes you a gain of about 11% in your speed. But in some other cases, because you have those echoes of echoes of echoes, you still get disruptions in your frames, and the result of enabling SGI is that suddenly your loss rate, number of frames you lose, increases because there are more collisions. So that's a feature that most of the time you have to enable or disable manually. It's typically disabled by default because it's 11%, so it's not a huge gain and it may have some risk. So if you see that feature in your controllers, you can try to enable it and see if you see a change in your average loss rate in your network. And if you see that the loss rate goes up, then you may want to disable that feature. If the loss rate goes exactly the same as it was before, well, you can keep it enabled.